Hey everyone, Mr. Davitt here. Hope everyone's doing well. As we get closer to the AP exam, obviously refreshing ourselves on past knowledge is so important. There'll never be a question on the AP exam about what president was president during these years, or how many Federalist presidents were there versus how many Democrat Republican presidents, or anything like that. But at the same time, these are arguably the most important men in American history. There have been 45 since the existence of the nation that have been president of the United States. That's a pretty low number considering that stretches about 230 years. And this is obviously an incredibly distinct title. These are men with kind of grandiose personalities. They are different in what they propose, they are different in what they did, and obviously, public fascination with U.S. presidents is always extremely high. If you look at the study guides that I posted, one of them deals specifically with the U.S. presidents, and it's very brief, but what it is basically the name of each president, the number president they were, what years they served, and then I attributed basically one kind of nickname to each of them. Some of these nicknames are more common and they were definitely not originated by me. Other ones are things I've kind of come up to because I think if you can take away one kind of main idea from each president, that's what I basically attempted to do. Some being obviously a little more positive than others. And I hope this video kind of serves as a reminder. In no way, shape, or form do I think that I'm going to be able to cover every single one in great detail, every single one, everything they did during the presidency. That is absurd. But what I do want to do is talk about some of the highlights, their legacies, and some of the big takeaways we can take from them. Because there is a chance that there's a question about a specific president or a question about a specific era and some of the presidential policies that happened there. So I think if we can establish some of these things, that might help us clarify some of these men and who exactly they were and what exactly they did when they held the Oval Office. So I want to start with obviously President number one, George Washington, from 1789 to 1797. Here he is right there. And the nickname I've given to him is pretty obvious, and it is the father of the nation. Remember that George Washington was the leader of the Continental Army. And if we talk about a story, we're talking about Britain being the most powerful country militarily in the world. We're talking about the 13 colonies who were disorganized and did not have military training, or much of it at the very least. And it's George Washington's leadership that was heavily responsible for the victory at the American Revolution. So obvious was he the nominee, or was he the selection to be president, that he was unanimously selected to be the president. That's something that's never happened before, and it's something that I doubt will ever happen again. So really showing that at the early stage of the country, the people really, really trusted him and really only saw him as the clear leader, which should say a lot because there were other delegates, 55 delegates, if you remember, at the Constitutional Convention, all of them pretty noteworthy characters, some other noteworthy American founding father characters that were not at the convention, and the fact that he was unanimously selected, I think, shows the fact that people had a tremendous confidence in this man. When we think about the first president or the first of really anything, a lot of it is about establishing precedents, and a lot of the precedents that George Washington established still exist today. So, for example, George Washington created the first cabinet, the advisors per se. Again, there were only a few at our first presidency, but that was something that was not necessarily outlined in the Constitution and something that he set up. And obviously, that's still a precedent that exists today. Economic policy, I know a lot of this was really crafted by his Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, but the fact that he allowed that to happen, and again, we're talking about a lot of precedent economically that would continue on. Things like the national debt, especially a big thing, the assumption of state debt's huge for successful navigation economically of the country early on. George Washington also really tried to push neutrality when he took office shortly after the French Revolution began. the disruption in Europe with the conflict in France, but also neighboring places, and he really pushed neutrality. And the fact that the country was able to stay relatively neutral during this period shows his desire to kind of fulfill that promise. And probably, maybe most famously, it was George Washington that set the precedent for the two-term tradition, something that would continue on, even though not necessarily a requirement, until Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And then after that, they decided to actually make it an amendment requiring this two-term tradition. But something very much respected, the idea being if George Washington could not be more president for more than 2 terms, how possibly could anybody else? So this, I think, is hugely significant. If you remember, when Washington left office, he gave his farewell address, one of the more famous speeches in American history, where he warned heavily about the dangers of a two-party system and the dangers of permanent alliances abroad. Both of these warnings would not necessarily be listened to, which is relatively unfortunate because we've seen the kind of dangers of the two-party system with the vast partisanship that's come into play. And obviously, especially with alliances moving into the 20th century, the United States kind of having to enter into conflict when not necessarily wanting to. But obviously, these are big takeaways we can think about of our first president here. So really, the father of the nation. John Adams, our next president, and you'll notice here that for the remaining presidents, their political party is listed up top. John Adams, our Federalist president. George Washington maybe technically could be considered a Federalist, but at the end of the day, he really was no party. So I like to acknowledge that because he's really our only president not to be affiliated with a political party. John Adams serving only 1 term from 1797 to 1801, and really one thing we can say about John Adams is it's really hard to follow the first, and it's really hard to follow somebody like George Washington, who was so immensely popular and who had tremendous confidence from the American people. Well, again, this is the kind of the overarching question. How do you replace somebody that was unanimously selected? How do you replace somebody that did so well in navigating the early stages of the country? And the reality is that is going to be a question that Adams is going to have a hard time kind of figuring out. Something that oftentimes gets overlooked is John Adams was responsible for creating peace and alliance with France after some turbulent things might have shifted the country into conflict. And that actually was relatively important. It's actually that a peace and alliance with France that he establishes in his presidency that will be the foundation for the Louisiana Purchase during Jefferson's presidency. But John Adams doesn't really get credit for that. Instead, John Adams is mostly remembered for some of the more negative things that occurred during his presidency. The passage of things like the Alien and Sedition laws, which heavily targeted free speech and immigrants in order to try to silence the opposing political party, the Democrat Republicans. And in response, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions were passed, and these things talked about secession for really the first time. And so we see that disunity that already existed kind of becoming much more fluid, I suppose, through the presidency of John Adams. And I think John Adams' presidency is a reminder that by the time he got the presidency, the country was still incredibly young. And the reality is building a young nation is hard. Washington was able to do so relatively well because of his exceptional leadership abilities and qualities. John Adams, unfortunately, will not have the same luck. Thomas Jefferson is our third president. He's our first Democrat-Republican president, serving from 1801 to 1809, a 2-termer. Here we see him here. And this is the nickname I've given him, the man of the people and small government with a question mark. Some of the nicknames I've given to the presidents have a question mark in order to kind of convey kind of a challenge to sometimes what's thought of in the traditional sense when we think of these presidents. And I think when we think of Thomas Jefferson, we definitely think of a challenge to somewhat of the traditional rhetoric, and we definitely think of somebody that came in with a plan and came in with kind of various theories of how to operate, and the realities of the presidency brought him into doing something else. It is important to acknowledge that Thomas Jefferson, as our first Democrat-Republican president, will see a peaceful transition of power, the move from John Adams and the Federalists to Thomas Jefferson and the Democrat-Republicans. This is something that's a huge precedent in the United States, something we largely take for granted, and the reality is we probably shouldn't, because in many countries, they have really had trouble peacefully transitioning power. But this is a big moment where this happens for the United States. It happens relatively easily, and it's one that we've really seen throughout the existence of the country. Thomas Jefferson's major theory is of small government, and he really pushed that. That was a major focal point of the Democrat-Republicans as a whole. And another part of his kind of ideas was to reduce the size of the military. Yet it will be Thomas Jefferson that will be president as the U.S. enters its first formal war conflict, the First Barbary War. A small war with some of the pirates of northern Africa, but nonetheless important to acknowledge this. Probably the most contradictory thing that happens between Jefferson's theory of small government towards actually utilizing government in a huge way is going to be through the Louisiana Purchase, a moment when government authority will be at its highest stretch yet. And it kind of points to this idea that Jefferson really wants to acquire the territory, yet it's going to require a huge amount of federal power that is not necessarily given to the federal government. And even though it had been Jefferson's idea that that should not be something the federal government does, the enticement of the Louisiana Territory will be too much for Jefferson, and he will negotiate the Louisiana Purchase with Napoleon and France. We also remember that Jefferson will be president during a time of increased tensions with Britain, and this is when he'll place the embargo on Britain, which will largely be a failure, overestimating the power of U.S. goods, overestimating the power of the U.S. Navy to enforce this type of thing. But nonetheless, I bring this up to kind of foreshadow what's going to happen with our next president. When we think about Jefferson, we definitely think about a relatively strong president, but a president that is a contradictory person. Someone that was supposedly identified with the common man, yet absolutely an elitist and, one of the richest men in America at this point in time. Talking about somebody that also, supposed to be a man for the people, yet a slave owner, and had a sexual relation with one of his slaves that actually led to slave children. And we talk about somebody that really pushed this idea of small government, but at many points in time expanded the role of government to a level even bigger than we had seen up to this point. So showing us kind of the ideal of the office versus the actual realities. Our next president, James Madison, a Democrat-Republican, and 1809 to 1817, and I put hero of the War of 1812. First off, by the time Madison comes to the presidency, inheriting a huge conflict with Britain that will eventually lead to war in 1812. And if we think about 1812, it's not really a defeat for the United States, but it's not really a victory, more of a stalemate than anything else. But does kind of settle a conflict overseas and allows the U.S. to kind of look within, and also kind of sees a little point of nationalism within the United States. And we see this through the institution of the Second Bank of the United States under Madison. We see this through the implementation of a higher tariff, all of which would be pointing to the idea of nationalism here. Madison also is a sign of continued Republican rule, and what we see through his presidency is the huge weakening of the Federalist Party, so much so that the election of our next president, James Monroe, the next Democrat-Republican, will be relatively seamless, serving from 1817 to 1825. It's Monroe that presides over the era of good feelings. And why is it the era of good feelings? Well, continued Democratic Republican rule as the Federalists really lose their ability to be an effective opposing political party. We also see a time of relative peace with the conflict with Britain being done and kind of looking elsewhere. However, this period will also see the panic of 1819, a relatively serious economic depression that will hit the country. And it will also see the rise of sectionalism. And the big moment that happens under Monroe is what to do about balancing slave and free states with the proposed statehood of Missouri. And luckily, this will be resolved through the Missouri Compromise. But, again, this compromise, although it works, is incredibly small scale. It only deals with really the statehood of one state. And when we get to more states, this is going to be much more complicated. And this should show us that this conflict between slave and free and the sectional issues will be something that will linger for quite a long period of time. It's also Monroe that towards the later part of his presidency will announce the Monroe Doctrine, thus declaring the Western Hemisphere off limits to European countries. And although at the time the United States really did not have the military capacity to actually enforce the Monroe Doctrine, just the fact that Monroe states it is our first really sign of U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere, or at least the U.S. stating their dominance in the Western Hemisphere, really in the history of the country. So something else that's also important to acknowledge. Our next president is Democrat-Republican as well, and this will be John Quincy Adams. And he serves from 1825 to 1829, only a one-termer. And we put next to him the corrupt bargainer. And that has a lot to do with the fact that Quincy Adams is probably remembered most for what happened in the election of 1824 versus what he actually did during office. And that has a lot to do with the fact that, if you remember, there's 4 major candidates running for the presidency in 1824, and there's no majority. So Henry Clay, being the Speaker of the House, was responsible for choosing basically the next president, and he gave it to John Quincy Adams. Now, the reason he gave it to him, they were somewhat friends, but a lot of this had to do with the fact that Quincy Adams had more similar viewpoints with Henry Clay than any of the other presidential candidates. So it wasn't necessarily a corrupt bargain, but doesn't really matter. Because at the end of the day, Quincy Adams will still be a minority president, so the majority of the people of the United States did not vote for him. His nationalism program will also be relatively unpopular at this point, as we see sectionalism and the sectional divide growing between North and South, and even to an extent the West at this point in time. And the fact that he's going to have this connotation of being the corrupt bargainer is going to mean Andrew Jackson is basically going to start campaigning against him for the election of 1828 as soon as Quincy Adams takes over the presidency. So that's going to be no good for Quincy Adams. The reality is, John Quincy Adams, if we really think about a politician, he was Secretary of State during the Monroe presidency. It was really him that crafted the Monroe Doctrine. Excellent Secretary of State. Upon his end of presidency, he actually will become a member of the House of Representatives, something that is extremely rare, and we rarely ever see done for a president to actually return to political life after the presidency. He does a great job there until his death in the late 1840s. However, he was just not the great president. Some other circumstances obviously going to make things challenging for him, but this will not be very good for him, and unfortunately gaining more notoriety for what happened in the 1824 election versus anything else. It is going to be the next president, Andrew Jackson, that felt short-sighted and felt cheated by what happened in 1824, and it's one of the reasons why he's going to be pretty easily elected in 1828. Also put here an advocate of the common man because Jackson kind of takes Jefferson's program of advocating for the common man, being a president of the common man, take it kind of one step further. But I've also put the question mark here because is that necessarily true? And I'm not 100% sure. One of the things that Jackson will do that's an important precedent for later on is Jackson will really be the president to kind of use and implement the spoil system so much more than our other presidents. And it's important to kind of acknowledge this program for rewarding political supporters because of the fact that it's a big part of the partisan type of program. And definitely we see Jackson do this to reward kind of his supporters into public offices and public positions. What we also want to remember, though, is that there's a lot of big tension and a lot of big issues that occurred during Jackson's presidency. And the reality is his toughness and his fierceness, maybe because he was a war veteran and just part of his personality, is going to kind of have him really taking a rough edge and kind of a tough position on a lot of these different things. So our big kind of issue that will occur, one of them at least, will be the tariff nullification crisis, where South Carolina claims that this idea of nullifying acts of the federal government, they're really going to push that as being constitutional. Jackson will threaten troops on South Carolina, and we really have the closest point that secession has occurred up to this point. Does not happen, war is averted, but at the same time, a pretty tough stance that we see here. We also see Jackson's horrible treatment of Native Americans, basically no respect for their tribal traditions, no respect for their land, and so we see something like the Trail of Tears. And we also see, by the way, through this, his basically disregard for the decisions of the Supreme Court that had actually said that Native Americans were supposed to be on that land. We also saw Andrew Jackson say that the Bank of the United States was a horrible institution and that it went against the needs and the affairs and the necessity of the common people. And so as a result of this, Jackson will crush the Bank of the United States, even though technically kind of had been declared constitutional in earlier Supreme Court decisions. Definitely, he is somewhat a man of the people. I mean, they love him. They see him as their advocate. He praises that when he crushes something like the Bank of the United States. He crushes this idea. You know, he puts the people on his side, or at least he claims to be, when he takes land away from the Native Americans and gives it to the American people. And during Andrew Jackson's presidency, we do see the rise of suffrage for males in the United States, where really by the end of his presidency, all males have the right to vote, other than black males, ridding of the property requirement. Yet, if we think about Andrew Jackson, he stretches the power of the federal government to levels really unseen up to this point. He oversteps his power in quite a few ways, taking these responsibilities upon himself when in reality they probably should not have been. And he also does not listen to the Supreme Court when he makes a lot of the decisions that he does. So this is something else that's worthy of acknowledgement here also. Jackson is a strong enough president where he's able to get his kind of successor into play, which is Martin Van Buren, 1837 to 1841. And the nickname, by the way, of most historians is Martin Van Buren is the Little Magician. And I thought I would just keep that for Van Buren. Jackson's successor, so although he is elected, Jackson really pushes his presidency and his nomination. And what we want to realize is Van Buren inherits all of Jackson's enemies, but he does not necessarily inherit Jackson's style or Jackson's leadership or those type of things. And so as a result of that, he's going to have some trouble. And he's going to meet a lot of heavy opposition early on. Also, he is president over a pretty bad financial crisis in the Panic of 1837. This is not really his fault. It's more so through the elimination of the Bank of the United States and Jackson's kind of economic policies to replace the Bank of the United States that did not really work. that the Panic of the 1837 will happen. But nonetheless, Van Buren takes all the blame as he's the president during this time. And what we also see here is that in response, Van Buren does something of his own, which is to establish an independent treasury. So not another Bank of the United States, but something that is hopefully going to help resolve some of the economic issues. Van Buren is also going to have some sectional problems, most notably with Texas, who during his presidency will successfully become their own independent state. They will not be annexed at this point, but they're looking to be, and Van Buren kind of sits quietly, not necessarily knowing what to do. But after 4 years, the people are pretty much done with Van Buren and ready to move on. Our next president is William Henry Harrison, a Whig, our first Whig president, serving in 1841. And really, there's only a few things to say here, and that is basically he should have worn a coat. Because if you remember, after he's elected, he has his inaugural speech, which stretched about 4 hours on a rainy day, and he contracts pneumonia of some sort and dies, thus becoming the shortest serving president in United States history. With that being said, it is important to acknowledge that he is the first Whig president, so we'll see a few Whig presidents. He's the first one. And the other thing is he becomes the first president to die in office. And his vice president, John Tyler, will take over as president, even though that had not necessarily been spelled out in the Constitution. So there is some noteworthiness of Henry Harrison's presidency. And that's worthy of acknowledgement here also. The vice president of Harrison is John Tyler, also a Whig, and let me make a couple comments about him. Really, what I can say here, and probably his most notable legacy, is his acquisition of Texas. So like I said earlier, the first vice president to take over for the president, he decides that he's going to become the permanent president, even though that had not necessarily been something explicitly spelled out in the Constitution early on. And something else worth acknowledgement here is he does see the right of the United States to acquire Texas, and it's one of the last things that he does before he leaves office, and Texas becomes officially a U.S. state. A lot of Americans had moved into the Oregon Territory. He's going to make some settlements there in order to make the U.S.'s transition there a little bit easier, primarily with Britain. And the other thing that he does is he does solve a border dispute for Maine on the Canada border up in the northeast. So something else that we're looking at in regards to expansion. And it will also be John Tyler that will preside over Florida becoming a state. So all these are significant things that really look at Tyler more so being one of our first preliminary expansion type of presidents and setting the foundation for our next big expansionary president, James K. Polk. And we see here James K. Polk, 1845 to 1849. And I think an effective nickname for him is Dark Horse Efficiency, because Polk is going to be a dark horse, really our first major dark horse candidate, and then will actually end up winning. But really what he set out to do, he did relatively efficiently. So it's important to acknowledge that that is success. And the big thing that he wanted to accomplish that is manifest destiny. And he really sets out to expand the United States from ocean to ocean. He starts what Tyler does and kind of finishes it through the continued settlement of Oregon, once again resolving some border issues up in the northern part of Oregon Territory. And the big note of fame for Polk is that he is president over the Mexican-American War. And some critics have argued that he kind of enticed Mexico into a war looking for the spoils of war and that type of thing. Absolutely could be the case, but the reality is if Polk was an advocate of manifest destiny, which we know he was, we do see a huge land acquisition happen during his presidency from the Mexican-American War. So, maybe some questionable motives, maybe some questionable things, but either way, this does get done successfully. What's also interesting about Polk is that Polk is relatively popular, but he had said he was only going to serve one term. And he stakes true to that promise. And just kind of an FYI, we talked about this before. Typically, if you're a president, as long as you don't do anything terrible, you run for re-election because the chances of you being re-elected are relatively high. People already know your name. People can also argue, hey, can't get any worse, because it wasn't that bad. And Polk definitely, relatively popular, had done some big things. Certainly the acquisition of all the land from the Mexican-American War and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was big towards that. However, the fact that he stepped down, relatively significant, and we don't have many instances of that in American history where a sitting president who's relatively popular decides not to run for re-election. It's into this that we hit into some of our rocky presidents of the 1850s, and that's because, if you remember, sectional tension extremely high in the 1850s, and these are some of the men that are going to be leading the nation and are not going to really do a great job with that. Our first is Zachary Taylor from 1849 to 1850, and I'll put almost Civil War. He's a military hero from the Mexican-American War. Reminder, though, just because you're a military hero does not necessarily mean you're a good president, but he's largely pressured into running by the Whigs, who think, he's a logical choice. He'll get the nomination because of his military heroism, and he'll guide the country successfully. Will not be the case. Because the reality is, as Taylor takes over, California now has enough people because of the gold rush to become a state. And so because of that, all of a sudden that balance between the slave and the free states is going to become so complicated and so complex. So the question becomes, what is there to be done? It's within this and really deciding what to do with all that territory from the Mexican-American War that we see a huge growing sectional tension arising. And we see a lot of questions about what to do and what state should be free and what should be slave and all the rest of these things. And the reality is, during Taylor's presidency, not a lot of concrete solutions or concrete compromises on the table in order to try to resolve this crisis. And really not the guy for the job in such a sectional and divided time, and he dies prematurely. And some would argue that if he was still the president, Civil War would have happened before 1860 because of the fact that tension was so high in 1850 during his presidency. And there was, again, the Nashville Convention, for example, which talked about secession for the first time in 1850 and making that a reality. So, again, secession could have happened earlier. Okay, in takes Millard Fillmore, serving from 1850 to 1853, another Whig. And when Fillmore takes over, he takes over an incredibly messy and complex situation, in particular with California, with these states, about what exactly to do here. And secession is extremely close, and Fillmore has a tough kind of thing to navigate. The reality is, though, he is able to get through the Compromise of 1850. Now, again, he's not really the major person that puts that together. That's more so Henry Clay, who's almost dead, and then Stephen Douglas, who will kind of take the reins and be able to get the successful passage through. But it is Fillmore as the president who's able to see this through, and we see crisis very much averted. And the reality is, Compromise of 1850 is not the best compromise by any stretch. It doesn't obviously successfully end all sectional conflict because we're going to have Civil War and secession in 1860, 1861, about 10 years later. But after the Compromise of 1850, things settle down, deep breaths are had, and those talks of secession from the South largely fizzle away, as that's seen as kind of like unnecessary at that point in time. The 1950s always a shaky time when we're talking about American presidents, and even though there's going to be some consolation and some recovery of tensions in the Millard Fillmore presidency, things go from ugly to very ugly relatively quick, and that has to do with a couple of the remaining 1850s presidents, the first being Democrat Franklin Pierce from 1853 to 1857. At a time of conflict, what a lot of these presidents were kind of like compromise-type people, and Franklin Pierce is an example of that because even though he was from the North, he was an advocate of pro-slavery, so seen as being someone to appease both sides. The reality is, though, his pro-slavery views very much overwhelmed his sectional identity as being a Northerner. So committed was Pierce to expanding slavery that he even attempted to purchase Cuba in order to become a state so that could be a place where slavery could be expanded. Also talk about other Latin American countries as well. This infuriated the northern part of the United States, again, disrupting this balance between slave or free and kind of causing more and more issues and problems. And although Franklin Pierce was not necessarily the architect behind the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which advocated for popular sovereignty, when deciding the slave issues for states, Franklin Pierce was the person that definitely helped push it through during his presidency. The idea that this would give the possibility, basically, of slave states in places where that probably wouldn't have been the case before. And as we know, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was horrible. Popular sovereignty never existed. And so bad was it that the situation erupted in Kansas into the Bleeding Kansas. Lawlessness, basically the Civil War before the Civil War inside this one singular state, a time of unrecognized government or anything like that. And the reality is Pierce really, through his policies and through his clear advocating of pro-slavery and of the South, is going to lead the country closer and closer to the wartime. Things go from bad to worse with our next Democrat president, James Buchanan, serving from 1857 to 1861. And this nickname of not the person to save the day is probably generous when thinking about Buchanan. Because Buchanan was an experienced politician, somebody that had served in public office for decades, really, seen as somebody that could hopefully help navigate the problems, but not going to be the case at all. A lot of big things happened in the 1850s, and it's not necessarily like these are totally his fault, but he doesn't do a whole lot to try to settle fears. And so we see that with the very controversial Supreme Court Dred Scott decision, and this is where Buchanan basically says nothing about this decision, that deems the inabilities of really blacks to sue in court, sees slaves as being nothing more than property that could be moved from state to state, territory to territory, even if they were free. And he really says nothing and will actually be more positive on this decision than many. He also is president during the time when we get the closest to the Civil War, before the Civil War, which is John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. And this is really a problem for, well, a lot of different reasons, but our biggest thing here, Buchanan quiet as Brown attempts to raid the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, and although it fails, this really is the South's worst nightmare. The North feels kind of odd about this as well, and just more and more tensions and problems. Under Buchanan's presidency, secession becomes very, very close to inevitable. Again, it doesn't quite happen, but it's very, very close. And we think about Buchanan as somebody that definitely exacerbated problems and does not provide the necessary leadership in a time of great peril and frustration and issues. For all that talk about weak presidents, what we see in our 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, is probably our best U.S. president, serving from 1861 to 1865, and there's no really other way to say this than Lincoln as being kind of the perfect wartime politician, president, and also the savior of the nation. When Lincoln takes over, there's a lot of doubts as his political experience was minimal, and same with his military experience. However, what is great is that Lincoln was a learner, and Lincoln committed himself to learning about military and political strategy. The first summer of the war, he spent reading books about previous wars, military strategies, other things like that, which would prove really, really effective. He listened to his cabinet, yet he was enough of a leader to not over micromanage them and kind of let them be able to do their duties, something that we definitely did not see with Confederate President Jefferson Davis. And he does many things during the war that really helped the Union win. One, probably most significant, is he changes the meaning of war to be about slavery when he issues the Emancipation Proclamation in the later part of 1862. By doing this, he ensures that the Confederacy will not gain foreign assistance, something they would have heavily benefited from. So he does this because it's smart and it makes a lot of sense. He's a needed leader. His military strategy is going to be very, very sound and very, very smart. The border states never secede. They sit as kind of a buffer. That is heavily his responsibility, and he can take credit for that because of the fact that he doesn't push them, and he doesn't pressure them into getting involved, but kind of respects their neutrality, which is just fantastic because that will provide a nice little buffer for the Union armies. He changes war generals after his first major general, McClellan, is so disobedient to him. And he also sees the huge advantage man-wise that the North has and is willing to kind of allow Grant and Sherman to kind of practice this war of attrition, knowing that even if the Union loses tens of thousands of soldiers, the South simply cannot keep up. So that's going to all work out relatively well for Lincoln and the Union military. It's Lincoln that is responsible for the end of the war. If you remember, towards the later parts, the South is trying to come back under a compromise where slavery may still exist. Lincoln does not allow that to occur and forces them to surrender essentially unconditionally. And from what it seems like, Reconstruction, this really complicated time when we talk about rebuilding the nation and bringing back in these states that seceded from the Union, is going to be in really strong hands under Lincoln. However, he's assassinated basically within a week after the Confederate surrender, and so now all of a sudden the very complex and brutal task of Reconstruction is under serious question. The extremely complicated and complex task of Reconstruction is going to fall under the hands of Lincoln's Vice President, Andrew Johnson, and this is not going to be the person that was the best for this monumental task. Johnson was nothing more than a logical vice presidential choice in a very contested 1864 election. He was from the South but had not seceded with the state. He was a Democrat, but he runs on this kind of joint ticket that Lincoln and the Republicans put together, so he definitely had Republican and Northern leanings. And because he wasn't from the planter aristocracy of the South, and because he had stayed with the Union even during his state secession, he seemed like he was going to be the real solid, logical choice to really let the South know what they did was unacceptable. And that's not what we see at all, as basically Johnson's plan for Reconstruction has been dubbed the 0% plan. He grants numerous pardons to Confederate leaders and Confederate military personnel. He allows the planter aristocracy to come back in and reacquire their land that had been taken away during the wartime. And he lets the southern states back in extremely easily, as he basically does not believe in rights of now recently freed slaves. He will have a lot of problems with the radical Republican faction of the party that was really trying to promote for much harsher sanctions against the South and much more protections and rights for African Americans. And because of that, he's going to be close to impeachment. But because of his leanings, what we do see is the rise of the South, as really they should be devastated from this war, but we're going to start to see Southern Democrats come to office in the South. We're going to start to see the oppression of newly freed blacks, and so this is incredibly problematic. After one term, Johnson's done, really after his attempted impeachment, where he only is one vote away from impeachment. His presidential term is done, and now the quest for the country is to find somebody that's really going to be able to take on the mighty task of Reconstruction. And with that sentiment in mind, the Republicans decide on Ulysses S. Grant, the major hero of the Union Army. However, it's important that we realize, and again, this is something that we see sometimes throughout American history, just because somebody is a war hero does not mean they're going to be a good president in a dire time. Grant was not really interested in being a president. He was not really a politician by any stretch. But there was a lot of pressure and there was a lot of feelings that he would be the person to take care of this type of stuff. It's not that Grant doesn't try to be somewhat harsh to the South. He does pass some laws trying to mitigate the effectiveness of the Ku Klux Klan and all these type of things, but they're really ineffective. And what we see instead is Southern power really rise during Grant's time. Southerners who had seceded now going to be entering back into the House of Representatives and Senate. They're going to be taking over the governorships of southern states. They're going to be taking over or taking back their mayorships and local councils and things like that. And this is where we really see Southern redemption taking its toll as old Confederates decide they do not want blacks to be able to exercise their rights or really be anything close to equal under the law. We see massive corruption in Grant's cabinet. This is incredibly problematic. It's not really necessarily him. It's his friends that he puts into power that abuse their power through a variety of different dealings. And what we see is that Grant, although maybe he'd like to pursue Reconstruction, knows it's unpopular. He can feel its unpopularity and will destroy the Freedmen's Bureau and other types of things to basically ensure the death of Reconstruction. Technically, though, the death of Reconstruction happens with our next president, Rutherford B. Hayes, from 1877 to 1881. Really, the nickname for him is Rutherford B. Hayes because he really didn't win the presidency. This is that contested election of 1876 where there's those 20 votes in question. He would have needed all 20 in order to get the majority in the Electoral College. And in a backdoor deal, he's given all 20 in order to pull the federal troops out of the South and effectively end Reconstruction entirely. This obviously kills Reconstruction. When people find out about this, they know this is nothing more than a fraudulent guy. He's one of our forgettable presidents, really, for the most part, until the rest of for the rest of the 1800s. Most of the guys we see here are forgettable. More so in the Gilded Age and Industrial Age, we're looking at our captains of industry as opposed to our presidents as being the most influential and prominent people in U.S. society and government. But he does help usher in that Gilded Age in some sense, but really more so known for his fraudulent acquisition of the presidency as opposed to anything sound and good that he did in office. And next we're going to have James Garfield, a Republican. And it's during the Gilded Age that we see the spoils system really growing as supporters were given public office, other favors, and rewards for their support of candidates. What this sometimes led to was angry supporters who felt like they had given their support to the candidate and that they were unfairly not rewarded, essentially. And that's exactly what we see with Garfield, who's assassinated about 9 months into his presidency. Once again, a forgettable president here as well. The person that will take over is going to be his vice president, Chester Arthur, serving from 1881 to 1885. Looking at the spoils system that had killed Garfield and looking at what had kind of occurred, he understood the need to reform the spoils system to ensure that it was much more fair and people were not being rewarded into public office that didn't at least have some necessary qualifications. He established a civil service, making some appointments based on merit as opposed to personal promotion or something like that, and some other questionable spoils systems that he had gotten rid of. And so that all seems good. But the Republicans, trying to maintain their power and trying to really increase it in federal and public office, are going to look at what Arthur did and say, no, this is not good, and he will basically be pushed out of office through their disfavorability. Once again, a later president of the 1800s that we would definitely mark as forgettable. In comes Grover Cleveland, possibly more known for the tough campaign of 1884 that drew to light his illegitimate son. And let's say what we should recognize about Cleveland. Cleveland is the first true Democrat in quite some time, really since the 1850s. Even though Johnson, technically a Democrat, not really an elected Democrat, because again, he was appointed into office following Lincoln's assassination, and really part of that joint kind of union party that they put together during the wartime. During Cleveland's time, being the Gilded Age and being the Industrial Age, Grover Cleveland will absolutely be a big promoter of big business and all its workings. And he'll run into some issues with the tariff, in particular when he decides to lower it, which will cause dissatisfaction among industrial elites trying to protect American product. And once again, another one of our forgettable presidents of the late 1800s. Another forgettable president is our 23rd, Benjamin Harrison. And Benjamin Harrison is our first president to preside over $1 billion Congress, meaning the Congress had literally $1 billion to allocate for the first time in American history. He's going to decide to raise the tariff in order to protect American industry, thinking that as being important, which will lead to much dissatisfaction for our farmers, still making up a sizable percentage of the population, but much less than what they were before, as this was the industrial age when many were moving into the cities. It's because of things like the rise of the tariff, as well as some of the other problems that we'll speak about briefly, that we saw strikes, other issues being brought to light by farmers and poor workers, and we saw the rise of populism in order to try to promote interest, especially among our rural workers and population. And once again, another one of our forgettable presidents that only serves one term. For the only time in American history, we have Grover Cleveland, who becomes our first and only non-sequential president who serves 2 non-sequential terms. He's not much better the second time, as economic policy will lead to another big economic crisis, the Panic of 1893. And these type of things happen, but what brings disfavor with someone like Cleveland is his decision to not really do a whole lot in order to fix the panic, in order to fix the problems. One of the reasons why the panic happens has to do with the minimal amount of gold in circulation and in reserves, and that was a problem because at this point the U.S. was using the gold standard. He never solves really any of these problems. Instead, these will become a hot button issue in the 1896 election. And once again, even at our second time, Grover Cleveland becomes a forgettable president. If anyone knows him for anything, it's the fact that he is the only president to serve 2 non-sequential terms. Our last president of the 19th century is not a forgettable president because the reality is there are some significant things that happened during his relatively short tenure. First off, the whole gold standard issue that had been kind of on topic, hot button issue, etc., does go to bed as his election solidifies the gold standard, a positive for big business. Not necessarily a good sign for farmers, but nonetheless, with more people moving to the cities, not seen as that significant of a demographic anymore. He will also allow for basically a free reign for big business, as businesses will continue to monopolize. They will continue to pay their workers little. They will not have safe and sanitary conditions, but seen as something that's okay as long as big business is able to do what they need to do in order to amass huge profits. The bigger thing, though, I think when we talk about McKinley is our really big global president, and that this is really our major imperialist president. He's going to make the finalization of the Hawaii deal, and Hawaii will become a U.S. territory during his presidency. And he does He is the president for the Spanish-American War, where the U.S. officially becomes an empire, acquiring the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam, and some friendly arrangements in Cuba. What we know, though, is that empire is more complicated than just acquiring more land, as we do have things like the Filipino insurrection and other things that make empire kind of tough. And it's going to be one of the reasons why the U.S. is not going to be a huge advocate of actually keeping on to their empire. Our first major president of the 20th century is somebody that we know even before we took this course, and that's Teddy Roosevelt, serving from 1901 to 1909. I like this nickname, the Big Stick Bull Moose, because I think it encompasses a lot of what Teddy Roosevelt is all about. First off, he was a popular guy even before he was president. The hero of Cuba and the Rough Riders was added to the William McKinley ticket as vice president, and when William McKinley was assassinated shortly into his second term, it will be Teddy Roosevelt that takes over. Teddy will continue imperialism, but will do so not necessarily with the idea of acquiring new land directly as territories, but instead of as acquiring places in order to exercise U.S. military, political, and economic dominance. We definitely see the big stick through the creation of the Panama Canal. We definitely see the big stick through the sailing of the Great White Fleet in order to make sure everyone understands just how powerful the U.S. Navy is. And we see it through the Roosevelt Corollary, which basically sets a precedent of the U.S. as being the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere and removing any pretext from Europe coming over to collect debts. He's a Republican progressive. We know that he believes that the government as being key to fixing some of the injustices and some of the issues that were going on with big business. And we see some big strides as far as conservation is concerned. We see strides in consumer protection through Meat Inspection Act, Pure Food and Drug Act. We also see his trust busting and still acknowledging that trusts were not entirely bad, kind of differentiating between good trust and bad trust, but definitely going after big business and corporations that he thought were not playing by the rules. Teddy Roosevelt, absolutely beloved president, and somebody that was extremely popular. And even up to 1908, some people were hoping that he would run for an additional term, but he decides to step back. And one of the reasons why, not only trying to preserve the traditions of the two terms, even though technically he had taken over at the beginning of one, so, there was some gray area there, but it was because he was pretty confident that his successor was going to win the election, and that was Taft. And he was right, because Taft does win the presidential election. He's Teddy's successor, so the idea from Teddy was that he was going to kind of do everything that Teddy had started, and that's not going to necessarily be the case. Number one, he's relatively unpopular. He's more of an intellectual than a real people person. That's really tough, especially after you just had Teddy, who was such a people's person and so good at connecting with the common people. That being said, Taft was a trust buster, and more of a trust buster than Teddy Roosevelt, even though Teddy really gets the credit for that, bringing on over two times actually, the amount of trust-busting cases than Teddy actually did. His foreign policy will take a new kind of direction with dollar diplomacy, extremely unpopular in Latin America, as the U.S. basically came in and restructured Latin Americans' economic arrangements, typically with the purpose of benefiting the United States. And his disagreements with Teddy will lead to a pretty big split in the Republican Party and the emergence of a third party, the Bull Moose, which is really, by all intents and purposes, the party of Teddy Roosevelt. Woodrow Wilson, our first Democratic president in quite some time, serving from 1913 to 1921. And the reality is, kind of the only reason he wins has a lot to do with the fact that the Republican Party will be split, but nonetheless allows him to take over and be our first Democratic president in quite some time. He's going to continue with the progressive legacy started by his Republican predecessors, Teddy and Taft, And he does some big progressive reform, political reforms, banking, trusts. It's under him that we'll see the Clayton Antitrust Act, which is going to be a far more effective antitrust law than the previous ones. He's also going to have protections for workers and other things like that, which is going to be really, really great. A little bit into his presidency, we're going to see the emergence of World War One. He's going to try to stay neutral, going to be unable to, though, because of the decision to continue trading with the Allied powers, which is going to drag the United States into war. Even though the United States will be on the winning side, Wilson's much more concerned about the peace. He promotes the 14 points. Those are a failure. And he's so excited that the Treaty of Versailles gets a clause included for the League of Nations. All seems great. Not at all. Opposition to him had built at home among the Republicans and the isolationists, and the League of Nations will die, and he will basically die trying to get it ratified by a Congress, or in particular a Senate, that was made up of Republicans not interested, an isolationist American public, and also a general attitude and feelings that World War I had been a mistake, and that if the United States had been more isolationist, they would have never gotten themselves involved. The 1920s is all about our Republican presidents, and we start with Warren G. Harding from 1921 to 1923. Harding preaches on the campaign trail, and when he first comes into office, the idea of normalcy. Let's get back to normal and what we used to do. Let's stay out of foreign affairs. Let's go back to isolationism, and let's promote laissez-faire and let big business do what they want without government interference. This leads to an era of U.S. prosperity, but I put that very much in quotations because a lot of this was built on credit, was built on consumerism, and other kind of false indications that made it seem like the economy was doing better, but in all actuality, it was not. He's going to put his friends into positions of power, just like Grant did in the 1870s. This is known as his Ohio Gang, and this leads to massive corruption as people within his cabinet will take advantage of the huge government funds, and they're going to try to basically use those type of things in order to advance their own wealth. Nothing being more telling of this or showing of this than the Teapot Dome scandal. He suddenly dies in 1923. When he died, there was a lot of sadness. He had kind of been semi-popular, and then as soon as the corruption started to come out, Harding is a president that has had a pretty negative image and viewpoint of him. And again, similar to Grant, it wasn't necessarily him that was involved in corruption, but the lack of oversight and the promotion of unqualified friends in the government positions was largely responsible for this. Harding's vice president, Calvin Coolidge, will take over in 1923 and will serve up until 1929. Silent Cal is his nickname, and not only was he silent, he was extremely conservative and wanting to continue with that idea of laissez-faire and allowing big business to thrive. He's going to set up huge tax cuts for big business and corporations. That will allow them to hire more people, but it also leads to massive prosperity, little oversight, more trust, more kind of questionable business practices by our big business and corporation. Foreign policy-wise, Calvin Coolidge is not very interested, but he is interested in advancing U.S. economic interests, and it will be Coolidge that will navigate the Dawes Plan, which does provide necessary loans to Germany so they can pay their reparations to Britain and France, but then the U.S. is now able to get back their wartime loans. So it's not really done in the best interests of the world, safety, security, economics. It's really done so the United States can get their money. Still, for the most part, what we look at is isolation as the U.S. kind of tries to distance themselves from the rest of the world, and still definitely laissez-faire when we talk about government's involvement in the economy. From what it seems like up to the 1920s, things are going good. So why wouldn't another Republican president be elected, this time Herbert Hoover? And let the good times roll. Laissez-faire is working, prosperity's happening. Yeah, and again, if you recall, Herbert Hoover is elected relatively easily in 1929 to the presidency. However, things unravel very quickly. Stock market crashes October of 1929, kind of indicating that a lot of this prosperity was not necessarily real, and then that and a variety of other factors lent itself into the Great Depression. 25% unemployment, businesses shutting down business entirely, really, really bad things. Hoover, under this laissez-faire mindset, says it's not that bad. And also being a 1920s Republican, he says, you know what? Government doesn't need to step in here. People can fix this themselves if they push themselves through individualism and self-help initiatives. And maybe a little public works here and there. Well, that would be like the Hoover Dam. And that's about it. All right. And the reality is, individualism doesn't really work in a time of such economic distress, complete lack of hope, and the country and the people will immensely suffer. And Hoover basically becomes the most hated man in America, as even basically these huge homeless encampments made up of people who have lost their homes are going to be referred to as Hoovervilles. How bad times have come, and really how quickly the American populace has changed their mind from, hey, this is great, laissez-faire, everything's working out, to this has been a nightmare. So naturally, in 1933, it is going to be Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Democrat, with a new decision for the economy. And when we talk about presidents, our best presidents are the ones that are able to handle a crisis effectively. Roosevelt not only handles one crisis relatively effectively, he handles two, and that's the Great Depression and World War II. Roosevelt takes over, the economy is messy, and he decides direct government intervention, government programs to provide assistance to the people, government programs to provide loans and relief, government programs to provide jobs. The government is not going to sit on the sidelines. The government is going to be the way in which this relief and recovery happens. This is all part of the New Deal, and the reality is, even though the New Deal isn't a complete success, unemployment does go down a little bit, okay, jobs are created, and at the very least, it's better than what it was, and the other thing is that it does restore some confidence and some hope among the American people, and so that's really significant to kind of consider and look at. Also, kind of a changing role for the role of federal government as a whole. He also inherits a messy world situation, and initially he is neutral, noting, hey, look, we're not going to make the same mistakes of World War One. We're going to completely stay out of this. But as things progress, as it's clear that Hitler has an agenda of world domination, destruction of Jews, and other kind of more moralistic things, and the fact that Britain will be by themselves by 1940. The United States simply cannot sit around. So Franklin Roosevelt is going to mobilize the American people to fighting, even though this was an American people that were apprehensive towards doing so. The war is going to cost a lot of sacrifice, much more so than World War I. People are going to have to actually ration. Many more people are drafted into the war. A lot of moving parts. This is a total war, but FDR does a really nice job mobilizing the American people, cementing good popular support, etc. The other thing that FDR does that's really interesting is that he's able to change the mindset of the American people as being a global leader. And he does that even before they enter the war, by basically kind of looking at the responsibility that America has on the world stage. And that's something we're used to today. It's something that we know that the United States really is kind of, in many senses, the world police, the world leader, the real kind of person at the forefront of these major world organizations. But up to this point, the United States had really distanced themselves from that. And before World War II happened, and after World War I, they really didn't want to be involved with this type of stuff. But it's FDR that's really able to change the minds and hearts of the American people into kind of accepting and really enthusiastically supporting that type of role. So that's another significant thing to look at. FDR also becomes officially our first president to break the two-term tradition, runs for re-election in 1840, kind of acknowledging that there's a lot of chaos, consistency would be good, overwhelmingly reelected to a third term, and then in 1944, as World War II is still going on, same kind of necessity that he sees also, reelected relatively easily as well, and then he'll die short thereafter due to his ailing health problems. Our last president, not of the United States history, but just of the AP US History 2020 exam, is going to be Harry Truman. And here he is here, and he serves till 1953. And the reality is, if we weren't really stopping at World War II, I might have a different nickname here than drops 2 atomic bombs in 3 days. But because we're really going on to only into World War II, that's about where I'll stop it. A couple things to say here. Truman, by all intents and purposes, is an accidental president. Put on the ticket in 1945 because he was seen as somebody that might be able to garner some additional votes. Now, when he takes over, war is still going on, and the question kind of becomes how to end the war. Truman did not even know about the Manhattan Project or the atomic bombs as vice president. He only knew about it when he became president. So that's secretive and things like that. Well, due to growing tensions, the continued loss of American lives, and the fact that the Japanese would just not surrender, Truman will make the ultimate decision to drop the first atomic bomb August 6th, and then the second atomic bomb August 9th. And huge loss of Japanese civilian life, but this will end the war. It will be Truman that sees the U.S. into becoming a U.S. superpower, and for being an accidental president and taking over after FDR, a lot of kind of question marks, etc. like that, Truman is actually relatively effective in navigating the U.S. to power on a world stage, and also will see huge economic and domestic success, and a lot of that happening under Truman's watch, which is another kind of significant thing to kind of consider and look at here. However, some of the decisions Truman makes are going to help lead the U.S. into the Cold War with the Soviet Union. And again, a lot of these things were outside of his control by many stretches of the imagination. The end of Nazi Germany and the fact that the U.S. and the Soviet Union were so ideologically different, yet were occupying the two superpower zones, may have meant that Cold War or conflict was inevitable. But at the same time, it will be technically Truman and some of his decisions that will maybe exacerbate it a little bit more than expected. All right, so love the U.S. presidents. A lot of interesting stuff going on. These are unique people. They've all made their lasting contributions on U.S. history, even though this is short and by no means captures everything these people did. I hope this provides some further context and understanding to think about when we're thinking about these men and all the things they do. Hopefully it'll help you on the AP exam, and it'll help you in your U.S. history knowledge as a whole. Have a great day. Talk soon.